Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye, Apache. It is a true pleasure to have you join us once again as we return to the high, rugged wilderness of the New Mexico Territory in 1876. If you were with us at the end of Part 2 of the Embers of Mogollon, you will remember the dark, dangerous shadow that fell over the town of San Rafael. In the dead of night, a midnight telegram revealed that Elena's cowardly husband, Caleb, had sold the mineral and timber rights to their mountain homestead for $50 and a ticket to California. Standing in the frozen alleyways of the town, Silas had overheard Harlan Ramsey and a band of Silver City mercenaries plotting to burn Elena's cabin and run her off the ridge before the spring court session. And there, beneath the cold winter stars, the brave Chihen warrior had made a solemn vow that he would protect Elena and little Clara with his very life. Now, the long, bitter freeze of winter has finally broken, and the high country awakens to a new season of hope, beauty, and awakening desire. By the first week of April, the great thaw had arrived in the Black Range. The suffocating snowdrifts that had imprisoned the Mogollon Rim for 4 long months began to retreat under the steady, golden warmth of the southwestern sun. Down from the 8,000-foot granite peaks roared torrents of crystalline meltwater, tumbling through the sandstone ravines, filling the dry arroyos, and feeding the rushing currents of the Mimbres River below. The air, once sharp enough to freeze a man's breath in his throat, softened into something sweet, fragrant, and alive, carrying the rich, earthy scent of damp soil, melting pine pitch, and wild mountain sage. Down in San Rafael, baby Clara was now nearly 4 months old. Thanks to the tireless care of Martha Higgins and the steady supply of fresh venison Silas had quietly provided from the foothills, the little girl had blossomed into a chubby, bright-eyed infant with a mop of silky dark hair and a joyful, ringing laugh that could melt the hardest heart. Elena, too, had fully regained her strength. Her body was whole, her step was light, and the pale ghost of winter despair had been completely washed from her spirit. Yet, as the streets of the settlement dried into packed red clay, Elena knew she could not remain in the town. Martha Higgins had offered her a permanent home at the boarding house, and Sheriff Foster had made it known that she was welcome to stay in San Rafael as long as she wished. But Elena was the daughter of an Ohio farmer, a woman who had crossed 2,000 miles of prairie with a dream of building a legacy with her own 2 hands. She had no desire to live on the charity of a town where men like Harlan Ramsey looked at her with pity and whispered behind her back. Her home was not on the crowded boardwalks of San Rafael. Her home was on the high mountain homestead, the land she had cleared, the land where her daughter had drawn her first miraculous breath, and the land that now held the memory of the sacred hearth she had shared with Silas in the dark. When Elena announced her intention to return to the mountain, Martha had protested, but Silas had simply stood by the livery door, met her determined hazel eyes, and nodded with quiet, unshakable support. "I will hitch the wagon," was all he said. On a brilliant Monday morning, with the sky arched above them, in an impossible canopy of deep turquoise blue, they set out from the settlement. Sheriff Foster had quietly arranged for a sturdy wooden buckboard wagon loaded with provisions: 2 sacks of seed corn, garden spades, cured bacon, a firkin of lard, and a crate of young laying hens clucking nervously in the straw. Riding beside the wagon was Silas, mounted upon his powerful bay horse, with his Springfield carbine resting securely in its deerskin scabbard and a double-bitted felling axe strapped to his pack. As the team pulled the wagon up the winding mountain trail, climbing out of the dusty valley into the cool, pine-scented air of the foothills, the wilderness unveiled a transformation so breathtaking that Elena felt tears of pure wonder welling in her eyes. The brutal, monochrome wasteland of winter was gone. In its place, the mountainside had erupted into a riot of magnificent, vibrant color. Across the rolling foothills and beneath the towering ponderosa pines, vast carpets of yellow wild mustard and golden desert poppies swayed in the morning breeze like a sea of liquid sunlight. Along the rocky creek beds, thick clusters of purple desert verbena and scarlet Indian paintbrush pushed up through the damp needles, filling the mountain air with a delicate, honeyed perfume that tasted like summer. High above them, the granite cliffs of the Mogollon Rim gleamed in the midday sun, stripped of their icy armor, standing like ancient red rock sentinels guarding the green valley below. When the wagon finally crested the last rise and rolled into the clearing of the homestead, Elena gasped softly, clutching Clara tightly against her bosom. The cabin had endured. The heavy cedar logs, though weathered gray by the blizzard, stood firm upon their stone foundation. The stone chimney Silas had tended on that fateful night still pointed toward the heavens like a monument to their survival. The winter had left its scars, of course. The heavy snowpack had cracked two of the main cedar rafters at the rear of the roof, causing the shakes to sag dangerously over the lean-to pantry, and the weight of the drifts had torn away a portion of the front porch railing. The garden plot where she had hoped to plant potatoes was littered with fallen pine boughs and winter debris. Yet to Elena's eyes, it was the most beautiful sight on the face of the earth. Silas pulled the team to a halt outside the gate, dismounted with that effortless, fluid grace, and walked to the side of the wagon. He reached up, his large, warm hands wrapping securely around Elena's waist to lift her down from the high wooden seat. For a breathless second, as her feet touched the soft, spring earth, his hands lingered against the curve of her waist, and Elena's hands rested naturally against his broad shoulders. Her gaze locked with his dark, luminous eyes in the bright mountain sunlight. In that brief, suspended heartbeat, the memory of their winter trial passed between them, the blood, the fire, the hands held in the dark, and Elena felt a sudden, powerful surge of belonging that rooted her to this soil forever. "We are home, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We are home, Elena," Silas replied softly, his voice dropping into that deep, melodic cadence that always made her spirit settle into peace. They wasted no time. With the practical, tireless energy of frontier life, they set to work transforming the neglected cabin into a thriving sanctuary. While Elena swept the pine needles from the floorboards, opened the heavy cedar shutters to let the warm spring air chase the damp winter chill from the corners, and built a small, cheerful fire in the hearth to air out the quilts, Silas took his axe and climbed into the upper timberline behind the cabin. For 3 days, the high mountain valley rang with the clean, rhythmic, musical thud of Silas's axe biting deep into the heart of green ponderosa pine. Silas worked from dawn until dusk, with a ferocious, disciplined stamina that seemed almost supernatural. He felled 3 straight, mature pines, stripped them of their bark with a curved drawknife until the pale, resinous timber gleamed in the sun, and dragged the heavy logs down the slope, using his bay horse and a length of log chain. It was on the afternoon of the 4th day, as the temperature on the sun-drenched plateau rose into the pleasant, dry warmth of a high desert spring, that Elena experienced an awakening that would forever alter the landscape of her heart. She had carried Clara out onto the front porch, setting the baby down in a wide wicker basket lined with soft woolen flannels beneath the cooling shade of an old-growth juniper tree. Clara, kicking her little feet in the fresh air, was happily gurgling, batting her hands at the small willow rattle Silas had carved for her in the livery barn. Elena sat on the top step of the porch, a wooden bowl of dried pinto beans in her lap, sorting through them for the evening stew. Across the sunlit yard, 30 feet away, Silas was preparing the new roof beams. He had stripped off his heavy buckskin hunting shirt and his woolen undershirt, tossing them over a fence rail. He stood bare-chested under the brilliant, unfiltered glare of the high country sun, wearing only his dark buckskin trousers, held up by a wide leather belt, and his knee-high moccasins. Elena looked up from her bowl, and the breath left her lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp that froze her fingers in mid-air. She had known Silas was a powerful man. She had felt the crushing strength of his arms when he carried her through the snow, and she had seen his broad shoulders fill the doorway of the cabin. But she had never truly seen him in the light. His physique was a masterclass of nature, carved not by vanity, but by 28 years of running through granite canyons, hunting elk in the high passes, and enduring the brutal, unyielding demands of an Apache warrior's life. His skin was the color of dark, polished copper, glistening with a fine sheen of sweat that caught the golden afternoon sun like liquid amber. Across his broad, magnificent back and through the sculpted contours of his chest, thick cords of muscle rippled with every movement, shifting beneath his skin with the smooth, lethal grace of a mountain cougar. His waist was lean and tapered, his stomach flat and carved with iron sinew, his long, powerful arms ending in large, capable hands that moved with terrifying efficiency. Across the left side of his ribcage, Stretching from his shoulder blade down toward his waist, ran two long, faded silver scars, the marks of an old encounter with cavalry, saber steel, or a grizzly's claws, giving his chiseled frame an untamed, dangerous beauty that made Elena's heart hammer wildly against her ribs. Silas planted his feet wide in the red dirt. He raised the heavy, double-bitted felling axe high above his head, his spine arching, his back muscles bunching into knots of raw power, before bringing the blade down with a thunderous, explosive strike into the center of a notched log. Thwack! A shower of sweet, pale pine chips flew through the air, sparkling in the golden light. Silas let out a low, guttural exhalation of air, his chest heaving, his dark black hair bound loosely with a thin strip of red cloth, clinging damply to the nape of his neck. Elena sat on the porch, completely transfixed. She had been married to Caleb for 6 years, but Caleb had been a soft man, with pale, flabby arms and a restless, nervous energy that spent itself in saloon chairs and card games. He had never possessed this primal, majestic dignity. Looking at Silas now, Elena felt a sudden, intoxicating heat rush through her veins, a feeling so intense, so deeply physical and undeniable that it made her throat go dry and her pulse flutter in her wrists. It was the fierce, ancient awakening of a woman looking upon a man who was her protector, her provider, and the embodiment of everything true and strong in the natural world. She watched the sweat trickle slowly down the center of his spine, tracing the deep groove of his back muscles. She watched the flex of his bicep as he adjusted his grip on the hickory handle, the effortless power with which he rolled a 300-pound timber with a single thrust of his thigh. A wave of yearning, pure, honest, and terrifying in its intensity, swept through Elena's entire body. She realized in that breathless moment that her gratitude for Silas had long since outgrown the boundaries of friendship. She did not merely respect this man, she desired him with every fiber of her being. She wanted to feel those powerful, scarred hands against her skin. She wanted to bury her face in the warm, sun-baked scent of his chest. She wanted to belong to him as completely as the mountain belonged to the sky. As if feeling the weight of her gaze across the yard, Silas suddenly stopped his axe mid-motion. He lowered the tool, resting the heavy iron head on the timber, and turned his torso toward the porch. He raised his forearm, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. His dark, obsidian eyes found Elena sitting on the porch steps. The distance between them was 30 feet of sunlit red dirt, but the silence that fell over the yard was so dense, so electric, that it felt as though they were standing inches apart in the dark. Silas did not look away. He looked at her with an intensity that made the hair on Elena's arm stand up. He took in the sight of her sitting in the sun. The dark, lustrous waves of her hair, catching the golden light, the soft curve of her throat, exposed by the open collar of her cotton blouse, the gentle, maternal beauty of her figure, and the wide, luminous hazel eyes that were looking back at him with an unguarded, breathless hunger that matched the fire burning in his own blood. For 5 long, agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The only sound on the entire mountain was the soft cooing of baby Clara in the wicker basket and the whisper of the spring wind through the ponderosa pines. Silas's jaw tightened slightly, his dark eyes softening into an expression of raw, profound reverence. He gave her a slow, imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken current that was pulling their souls closer with every passing day. Elena felt a brilliant, burning blush rush to her cheeks, but she did not lower her eyes. She offered him a soft, radiant smile, a smile that carried all the quiet courage of her heart, before returning her trembling fingers to the bowl of beans. By late afternoon, the roof of the cabin had been completely transformed. Working together, they had hoisted the 3 new, massive pine rafters into place over the pantry, Silas lifting the crushing weight with his bare hands, while Elena secured the support posts with iron spikes. Silas then spent 2 hours splitting fresh cedar shakes, laying down a double layer of shingles that would seal the roof against the fiercest summer cloudbursts. He repaired the porch railing, cleared the heavy brush from the springhouse, and used a team of horses to plow 3 long dark furrows through the rich black soil of the garden plot, preparing the earth for the seeds of corn, squash, and beans they would plant in the morning. As the sun began its glorious descent behind the western peaks of the Mogollon range, bathing the homestead in long, dramatic shafts of crimson, violet, and molten gold. The day's labor finally came to an end. The cabin chimney was puffing a steady, fragrant plume of cedar smoke into the cool twilight air. Inside, on the cast-iron stove, a pot of thick pinto bean stew seasoned with smoked bacon was simmering merrily, filling the room with a warm, mouth-watering aroma, while a pan of golden cornbread baked to a crisp crust in the oven. Silas walked to the outdoor washstand beside the front porch. He filled the tin basin with cold, clear water from the spring bucket, leaned over, and plunged his face and head into the icy water, washing away the sawdust, sweat, and red mountain dust from his skin. He stood up, shaking the water from his long black hair like a magnificent stallion, droplets of crystal water catching the last rays of the sunset across his broad, bare shoulders. The cabin door opened with a soft creak. Elena stepped out onto the porch, carrying a clean, dry linen towel that she had warmed by the stove. She wore a simple dress of deep indigo cotton, her hair gathered loosely over one shoulder, her face glowing in the evening light. She walked down the 2 wooden steps and approached the washstand. "Here," Elena said softly, holding the linen towel out to him. Silas turned, his skin cool and dripping with water, his chest glistening in the twilight. He reached out to take the towel, but instead of handing it to him, Elena took a slow, deliberate step closer. Her heart was pounding like a drum, but her hands were steady. Gently, with a tenderness that took his breath away, Elena lifted the warm linen towel herself. She reached up on her tiptoes and began to pat the water from his chiseled cheeks, from the strong line of his jaw, and from the hollow of his throat. Silas stood completely motionless. He did not step back. He did not speak. His dark eyes burned down into hers with an intensity so fierce, so pure, that Elena felt her entire soul tremble in response. Her hands moved slowly, patting the towel down across the broad, smooth expanse of his chest, drying the water that had gathered in the hollow of his collarbone. Her knuckles lightly brushed against his warm, bare skin, and she felt the sudden, involuntary shudder that passed through his powerful frame at her touch. She felt the heavy, thundering rhythm of his heart beneath her fingertips, a heartbeat as wild, strong, and constant as the mountain itself. Silas slowly reached up. His large, warm hand closed gently, firmly around her wrist, stopping the movement of the towel. He did not pull her hand away. He simply held her wrist against his chest, pressing her palm directly over his heart, letting her feel the raw, undeniable truth of what lived inside him. Elena looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel the clean, warm scent of cedar, sun-baked clay, and masculine strength radiating from his skin. She looked into his dark, obsidian eyes and saw no barrier between them, no white world, no Apache wars, no past betrayals. She saw only Silas, the man who had saved her in the storm, the man who had rebuilt her home, and the man who held her heart in the palm of his hand. "Elena," Silas whispered, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated directly against her palm. "I'm here, Silas," Elena breathed, her lips parting, her eyes searching his. "I'm right here." For 3 long, sacred heartbeats, the world stopped turning under the New Mexico stars. The wind sighed through the ponderosa pines above them. The fragrance of blooming verbena drifted across the porch, and the quiet mountain night closed around them like a sanctuary, sealing the unspoken vow of 2 souls who had finally found their way home. As the golden days of May unfolded across the Mogollon Plateau, the mountain homestead settled into a rhythm of life that was unlike anything Elena had ever known. In her former life, along the Ohio River, and during her 6 difficult years with Caleb, education had been a rigid, divided thing. Men worked the fields with mechanical detachment, looking upon the earth as an adversary to be conquered, while women were confined to the parlor and the kitchen, shielded from the realities of the wilderness, until that wilderness suddenly threatened to consume them. With Silas, however, every sunrise brought a profound unraveling of those old, artificial boundaries. To the Cheyenne Apache, knowledge was not kept in locked rooms or hoarded in banks. It was written upon the wind, carved into the granite canyons, and spoken through the living pulse of the earth. And as the spring sun warmed the red rock arroyos, Silas began to share with Elena the ancient survival wisdom of his ancestors, a heritage of observation, reverence, and self-reliance that had sustained his people for 1,000 generations. Every morning, after the morning chores were finished and the laying hens were fed, Silas would saddle his bay horse and prepare a gentle pack mare for Elena. In a woven willow cradleboard that Silas had crafted and padded with soft doe skin and wild sweetgrass, baby Clara rode comfortably, secured against Elena's chest. The little girl would peer out at the sun-dappled forest with wide, curious eyes, soothed by the rhythmic sway of the horse and the gentle music of the mountain breeze. Together, they would ride deep into the secret folds of the Black Range, where the limestone cliffs opened into hidden, spring-fed canyons that white mapmakers had never named. It was here that Silas became her teacher. He did not teach with harsh commands, but with the quiet, patient grace of a man who understood that true wisdom must be felt before it can be understood. He would dismount beside a sun-drenched grove of pinon pines, lift Elena down from her saddle, and kneel with her in the fragrant needlecast beneath the ancient boughs. The pinon is the grandmother of the high country, Silas would say, his deep voice blending with the whisper of the wind through the needles. When the winter snows are deep and the game has moved to the low desert, the tree does not forget her children. She stores the fat of the summer sun inside these small shells. He showed Elena how to find the hidden winter caches of the mountain packrats, small, clean stores of rich, dark pine nuts tucked under rock ledges, taking only half so the small creatures would not starve. He taught her how to roast the nuts over glowing coals until the shells cracked with a sharp snap, releasing an oily, sweet meat that could be ground on a flat stone metate into a rich, nourishing meal capable of sustaining a nursing mother through the hardest freeze. He taught her the medicine of the green earth. He showed her how to strip the fibrous inner bark of the wild mountain juniper, boiling it into a rich, aromatic tea that cleared the lungs of winter congestion and purified the blood. He taught her to recognize the bitter root of the wild mountain ginger to settle a fevered stomach, and the silver-green leaves of desert sage, which, when crushed between the palms, released an oil that repelled biting insects and soothed burned skin. Near the dry creek beds, Silas would dig into the sandy soil to reveal the thick, soap-rich roots of the yucca plant. He would take a piece of the root, crush it between two flat river stones, and swirl it in a tin basin of clear spring water until a thick, luxurious white lather blossomed across his hands. The yucca carries the gift of water, Silas explained, a faint, gentle smile touching his lips as he looked at her. Your town soaps made of lye and animal fat burn the skin and dry the hair. The yucca cleanses without taking the life away. Wash your hair in the spring with this root, Elena, and it will shine like the wing of a raven. Elena listened with an awe that deepened with every passing day. She watched his large brown hands move among the wild plants with a gentleness that seemed almost miraculous for a warrior who could fell a charging bear. She realized that while white settlers looked upon this high desert as a barren, hostile wilderness to be feared and fenced, Silas moved through it as a beloved son walking through a bountiful garden provided by the Creator. He never took more than was needed. He never stepped on a blooming root without looking, and whenever he gathered from the earth, he would leave a pinch of crushed corn pollen or a quiet whisper of gratitude to the spirit of the mountain. Perhaps the most fascinating lessons took place in the damp red sand of the canyon floors. Silas would kneel beside a dry wash, beckoning Elena to crouch beside him. He would point his long dark finger at an almost imperceptible depression in the red earth, a mark that Elena's untrained eyes would have dismissed as nothing more than a fallen leaf or a swirl of wind. Look closely, Elena, Silas murmured, his shoulder brushing against hers as they leaned over the sand. Tell me, who walked here? Elena would study the ground, her brow furrowing in concentration. A horse? An unshod pony? Silas would shake his head softly, a quiet, approving warmth in his eyes. Look at the shape of the heel. An unshod horse presses deeper at the toe when it climbs. This mark is rounded, with 5 distinct pads that do not show claws. It is a large mountain lion, a male, carrying weight in his belly. He passed here 2 hours before sunrise, when the dew was still on the dust. See how the edges of the sand have dried into tiny crusts, but the center is still dark with moisture? He would stand, scanning the high limestone rim with that razor-sharp, predatory awareness that made Elena feel completely, unassailably safe in his presence. When you learn to read the sand, Elena, the mountain will never surprise you. The earth keeps a record of every footstep, every betrayal, and every kindness. You only have to quiet your mind enough to read what is written. As Elena absorbed his lessons, her respect for Silas grew into something vast and boundless. She saw a man of towering intellect, profound ecological genius, and deep spiritual philosophy, a man whose mind was as vast and disciplined as the territory itself. Yet, if the daylight hours belonged to the ancient wisdom of the Apache, the quiet evenings by the hearth belonged to a very different kind of communion. It began on a cool Tuesday evening in mid-May. Outside, the spring wind was sighing through the eaves of the cabin, bringing the crisp chill of 8,000 feet down from the snow-capped peaks. Inside, the stone hearth was glowing with a steady, fragrant fire of cedar splits, casting a warm, amber halo across the scrubbed pine floorboards and the whitewashed log walls. Clara, now 4 months old and growing rounder by the day, had been bathed in warm yucca water and dressed in her nightclothes. Before Elena could place the baby into her willow crib, Silas stepped forward from the shadows near the door, holding something behind his back. His expression was solemn, almost shy, a rare, touching vulnerability on the face of an Apache warrior that made Elena's heart skip a beat. "I have made something for the child," Silas said softly, in his deep, resonant baritone. He brought his hands forward. Draped across his broad palms was the most exquisite garment Elena had ever laid eyes upon. It was a tiny infant's dress, crafted from the finest, softest white doeskin, tanned with brain oil and mountain herbs until it felt as supple and smooth as heavy silk. Along the hem and the delicate sleeves ran long, soft fringes that swayed with every movement. Across the yoke, stitched with microscopic sinew thread, was an intricate, magnificent pattern of sky-blue turquoise beads and polished river shells, arranged in the sacred geometry of the Chihen, the morning star of dawn and the 4 sacred winds of the mountain. Elena let out a soft, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as tears instantly sprang to her eyes. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. You made this?" "I worked the skin during the winter nights in the barn," Silas confessed quietly, looking down at the tiny dress with reverence. "The turquoise is the stone of the sky. It carries the blessing of Usan. It turns away the evil eye, it cools the fever, and it reminds the spirits that this child is protected by the mountain. I wanted her to have the medicine of my people." Elena reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the velvet-soft buckskin and the cool, polished beads. She looked up into his dark, earnest eyes, overwhelmed by the profound depth of his devotion. In a world where society told them they should be bitter enemies, this man had spent hours in a cold hayloft by candlelight, painstakingly sewing a sacred garment of protection for another man's abandoned daughter. "Put it on her," Elena breathed, her voice thick with tears. Together, kneeling on the braided wool rug before the hearth, they slipped the soft doeskin dress over Clara's head. The white buckskin framed the baby's rosy cheeks and dark curls in breathtaking beauty. Clara gurgled happily, her tiny, chubby hands reaching out to grasp the cool, smooth turquoise beads on her chest, kicking her little legs in pure delight. Elena leaned her forehead against Silas's broad shoulder for a long, quiet second, whispering a prayer of gratitude that went far beyond words, before gently laying the sleeping baby into the willow crib. When she turned back to the hearth, Elena walked to the pine bookshelf beside the bed. She reached for the top shelf and brought down her most sacred worldly possession, a thick, leather-bound volume with gold leaf lettering on the spine, its edges softened by years of love and tears. It was her late mother's anthology of English romantic poetry, the book that had crossed the plains in her hope chest, the book that held the soul of her childhood. She carried the volume to the small pine table near the fireplace, where a glass-globed kerosene lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light. Silas was sitting on the low wooden stool, cleaning a leather cinch. He looked at the book in her hands with quiet, curious respect. "My people write their stories on the rock and in the stars," Silas said softly, nodding toward the volume. "The white man traps his thoughts in paper. Is that the book of your mother?" Elena sat down in the chair beside him, pulling the volume into the circle of lamplight. "It is," she smiled, her fingers gently stroking the worn calfskin cover. "My mother taught me to read from these pages along the Ohio River. She used to say that words on a page are like seeds planted in the soul. If they are true words, they will grow into beauty no matter how long the winter lasts." She looked at Silas, noting the quiet hunger in his dark eyes, an intellect that had mastered 3 spoken languages, yet had been systematically excluded from the written word by a frontier world that used contracts and treaties as instruments of theft. "Would you like me to teach you, Silas?" Elena asked softly, her voice rich with an offering of pure trust. "Would you like to learn to read the paper?" Silas looked from the book to Elena's radiant, open face. A profound, unvoiced desire stirred in his chest, a desire not merely to decipher the white man's symbols, but to enter the private landscape of Elena's mind, to see the world through the words that shaped her soul. "Yes," Silas answered quietly, "I would like that very much." He moved his wooden stool closer to her side. The proximity between them was intoxicating. Silas was so close that Elena could feel the clean, dry heat radiating from his broad shoulders, could smell the scent of cedar shavings, wild sage, and sun-baked leather that belonged exclusively to him. Elena opened the heavy volume to a page marked with a dried, pressed violet. The poem was Robert Browning's Rabbi Ben Ezra, a verse her mother had read aloud during the golden summers of her youth. The elegant, black ink script flowed across the creamy parchment in timeless beauty. "We start with the sounds, Silas," Elena murmured, her voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper that seemed to draw an invisible curtain around the small table. "These shapes are letters. Together, they form words. And words carry breath." She pointed to the first line of the poem. "Grow old along with me. The best is yet to be." Silas leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied the intricate, curving lines. He understood the concept, but the mechanical discipline of tracking small black marks across a white page was completely foreign to eyes trained to read the movement of an eagle a mile away in the sky. Silas sounded out, his deep baritone hesitating slightly over the unfamiliar shape. "R-O-W, grow," Elena encouraged gently, her heart warming at his earnest effort. Silas tried to move to the next word, but his large, heavily calloused index finger, thick from wielding axes and bows, covered 3 words at once on the delicate page. He pulled his hand back slightly with a soft, frustrated sigh, a shadow of self-doubt passing across his chiseled brow. Elena did not hesitate. Slowly, deliberately, Elena reached out with her right hand. Her soft, slender, pale fingers rested gently, completely over the back of his large bronze hand. The contact was electric. Silas's hand went completely still beneath hers. He felt the silky, cool softness of her skin against his rough, scarred knuckles, a touch so exquisite, so breathtakingly intimate, that his entire body tightened in response. Elena did not pull away. With infinite tenderness, she curled her fingers around his, gently guiding his scarred index finger back to the parchment, placing the tip of his finger directly beneath the first letter. "Do not rush, Silas," Elena whispered, her face turning toward his. Their faces were less than 6 inches apart in the golden amber pool of the lamplight. The rest of the cabin, the dark mountain outside, the entire territory of New Mexico, ceased to exist. There was only the warm circle of light, the soft crackle of the cedar embers in the hearth, and the heavy, thundering rhythm of 2 hearts beating in unison. Elena could feel the warm, steady fan of Silas's breath against her lips, a breath that smelled of clean mountain water and wild mint. She looked into his dark, obsidian eyes and saw the raw, unmasked fire of his desire, held in check only by the supreme, heroic discipline of his soul. Silas looked down at her lips, so close, so soft, parted in breathless anticipation. He felt the wild, hammering pulse in her wrist where his forearm rested against hers. The scent of her pure lavender, fresh milk, and the sweet, intoxicating essence of a woman blooming in love filled his senses until his head swam with longing. Under the gentle guidance of her hand, Silas's finger began to trace the line across the paper. "Grow," Elena prompted softly, her voice trembling with an emotion that had nothing to do with the lesson. "Old," Silas whispered, his deep voice vibrating through the wood of the table, directly into her hand. "Along," with Silas continued, his finger moving smoothly now, guided by her touch. "Me," they whispered together, their voices merging into a single, sacred harmony. Silas stopped his finger beneath the word. He did not look at the page. He turned his head slowly, his dark, piercing gaze locking onto Elena's wide, luminous hazel eyes. "Grow old along with me," Silas repeated aloud, speaking the words not as a student reciting a text, but as a man speaking the deepest, most terrifying truth of his soul. He looked into her eyes, his chest rising with a slow, heavy breath that brushed against her cheek. "Is that what the paper says, Elena?" he murmured, his voice thick with a longing so deep it sounded like a prayer. "Is that what you wish?" Elena did not look away. She did not blink. The tears that welled in her eyes were tears of absolute, fearless certainty. She pressed her hand tighter over his scarred knuckles, feeling the iron strength of the man who had pulled her back from the grave, the man who had cherished her child, and the man who had become her home. "That is what the paper says, Silas," Elena whispered, her lips inches from his, her voice ringing with the quiet, unshakable courage of her heart. "And there is no other soul in this world, or the next, that I would ever walk that path with." Silas drew in a sharp, ragged breath. His hand slowly turned beneath hers, his long, powerful fingers intertwining with hers, locking their hands together over the open page of poetry. For a long, suspended, holy moment, they sat in the golden lamplight, their breaths mingling, their fingers locked, their spirits crossing the final threshold into an unbreakable, eternal devotion. Outside, the mountains stood silent and watchful under the canopy of stars. But inside the cabin, the seeds planted in the dark had finally burst into glorious, unstoppable bloom. By the final week of May, the dry summer heat had begun to settle over the high plateaus of the Mogollon range. The midday sun beat down through the thin mountain air with an intense, golden brilliance that baked the red sandstone cliffs until they radiated warmth like giant kiln bricks. In the lower valleys, the smaller arroyos had already dried to cracked clay, but high in the sheltered canyons behind the homestead, where the underground springs bubbled up from deep limestone fissures, the mountain creek ran cold, crystal clear, and abundant. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the air was filled with the drowsy, pleasant hum of early summer. The pine cicadas buzzed in the high branches of the ponderosas, and a soft, warm breeze drifted down from the granite peaks, carrying the sweet, heavy perfume of blooming cliff rose and wild mountain mint. Elena, Silas, and baby Clara had spent the heat of the day down at the creek bend, 300 yards from the cabin. Here, beneath a cathedral-like canopy of massive, ancient cottonwood trees whose silvery green leaves fluttered like coins in the breeze, the rushing stream widened into a broad, tranquil emerald pool. The water, fed by the melting snowpack of the high peaks, was icy and pure, swirling gently over smooth, multicolored river pebbles before tumbling over a small granite ledge into the lower wash. On a wide, grassy bank carpeted with soft moss and shaded from the fierce afternoon sun, Silas had laid out a thick woolen quilt. There, 5-month-old Clara reigned like a tiny princess of the wilderness. Dressed in the soft, white buckskin dress Silas had made for her, her dark curls shining in the dappled sunlight, she lay on her stomach, kicking her chubby legs with endless energy. She gurgled happily, reaching her little hands toward the dancing shadows of the cottonwood leaves, clutching a polished piece of river agate that Silas had smoothed for her to hold. Nearby, Elena and Silas were finishing the week's washing. It was a scene of domestic harmony that looked so natural, so deeply rooted in the soil, that an outsider coming upon them would have sworn they had lived this life together for 100 years. Elena had rolled the sleeves of her light calico blouse past her elbows, pinning the hem of her dark blue work skirt up around her calves to keep it clear of the wet stones. Her dark hair was piled loosely atop her head, held in place with a carved wooden comb, with soft, damp tendrils curling around the delicate, sun-kissed curve of her neck. Her skin, once pale from the winter confinement of the boarding house, had taken on a healthy, golden glow that made her hazel eyes seem to burn with an inner, incandescent light. A few feet away in the shallow water stood Silas. He had rolled his buckskin trousers up to his knees, wading barefoot into the cold current. His shirt lay folded on the grassy bank, leaving his magnificent, sun-bronzed torso bare to the afternoon light. Elena watched him as she worked, her heart swelling with an emotion so deep, so profound, that it felt like an ache in her chest. She watched the fluid, effortless power of his movements as he hauled a heavy wooden tub of fresh spring water onto the bank, the sculpted muscles of his back and shoulders bunching and flexing beneath his smooth, copper skin with the untamed grace of a mountain cougar. He was a warrior, a hunter who could survive alone in the harshest desert on earth. Yet here he was, gently rinsing her mother's cotton pillowcases in the cold mountain current, wringing them out with his powerful hands, and laying them across the fragrant wild juniper bushes to dry in the sun. Whenever their eyes met across the water, Silas would pause. A look of quiet, unvoiced tenderness would pass across his chiseled, weathered features, a look that made Elena's pulse quicken and a warm, breathless flutter rise in the hollow of her throat. For months, they had lived in the sweet, agonizing tension of unspoken feelings. They had shared the hearth, they had shared the labor of the homestead, they had sat shoulder to shoulder in the golden lamplight tracing lines of poetry with their fingers entwined. Yet, with the disciplined, honorable restraint that defined his character, Silas had never pushed beyond the boundaries of gentle respect, waiting with infinite patience for the wounds of Elena's past to heal completely. And Elena, who had known only the hollow, selfish demands of Caleb, had found herself slowly falling into a love so vast, so terrifying in its beauty, that she felt as though her heart would burst if she could not speak its name. The afternoon began to wane, and the golden light shifted, turning the emerald pool into a sheet of shimmering amber and liquid topaz. Elena lifted a heavy wicker basket piled high with fresh, damp linens, intending to carry it across the stream to the sunlit clearing on the opposite bank, where the drying ropes were strung between two birch saplings. She stepped into the shallow water, her bare feet welcoming the shock of the icy current. She stepped from one flat river stone to another, with practiced care, the water swirling around her ankles, sending cool droplets splashing against her skin. Then, halfway across the pool, disaster nearly struck. Elena placed her foot upon a large, submerged granite boulder near the edge of the deep water. She did not see the slick coating of green river moss that covered the rock beneath the surface. The moment her weight transferred, her foot slipped sideways out from under her. "Silas!" Elena cried out, her arms flying wide as the heavy wicker basket tumbled from her grip, splashing into the current. Her body tipped backward toward the deep, icy pool, her head flying toward the jagged granite ledge behind her. In that split second, Silas moved. He did not merely react, he moved with the instantaneous, explosive speed of a mountain predator. With a single, powerful surge of his legs, he crossed 10 feet of rushing water in a spray of white foam, his boots digging into the riverbed, his arms reaching out like iron bands before Elena could even draw a second breath. His right arm wrapped securely around her waist, lifting her entire body clean off her feet, while his left hand came behind her neck, catching her head and cradling her against the hard, protective wall of his shoulder. The momentum of the catch threw them together into the waist-deep water of the pool. Silas planted his feet wide on the river bottom, bracing his powerful frame against the current, absorbing the entire impact of her fall without giving an inch. The world seemed to stop spinning. The only sound in the entire canyon was the soft, rushing murmur of the creek, the distant call of a canyon wren, and the wild, frantic splashing of water settling around their hips. Elena was pressed completely, breathlessly, against him. Her soaked skirts clung to her legs, floating in the crystal-clear current, while her upper body was crushed against the bare, sun-warmed expanse of his chest. Her hands, acting on pure survival instinct, had flown to his shoulders, her fingers digging into the hard cords of muscle, her face buried in the hollow of his collarbone. She was trembling, her chest heaving with the sudden shock of the fall, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps that fanned against his wet skin. Silas de Brescudo. He stood chest-deep in the emerald pool, holding her effortlessly in his arms, his feet locked upon the riverstone. His large, scarred right hand remained firmly planted against the small of her waist, pressing her hips flush against his, while his left hand rested against the back of her head, his fingers tangled in the damp, dark silk of her hair. Slowly, as the shock receded, Elena lifted her head. Her hazel eyes, wide, luminous, and dark with adrenaline, looked up into his face. Silas was staring down at her with an intensity so fierce, so raw, so stripped of every defense, that Elena felt the breath leave her lungs entirely. His chiseled face was only inches from hers. Drops of crystal spring water clung to his high cheekbones and dripped from the dark, straight strands of his hair, glistening in the late afternoon sun like liquid diamonds. His chest was heaving with deep, rapid breaths, and beneath Elena's palm, which had drifted down to rest flat against the center of his bare chest, she felt the heavy, thundering hammer of his heart. It was not beating with the slow, controlled cadence of a warrior in battle. It was pounding wildly, frantically, a heartbeat of raw, untamed terror at the thought of losing her, combined with a fierce, intoxicating passion that had finally broken through every dam of restraint. The silence between them stretched into eternity. A soft breeze drifted down the canyon, catching the high branches of the cottonwoods. A shower of delicate, fluffy white cottonwood seeds floated through the golden sunlight, drifting down around them like warm summer snow, settling on the water, on Silas's dark shoulders, and in the tangled waves of Elena's hair. Silas looked down at her lips, parted and trembling, then raised his gaze to meet hers. His hand on her waist tightened slightly, drawing her even closer, until there was not a fraction of an inch of air between their bodies. When he spoke, his voice was not the calm, measured tone of a scout. It was a low, rough murmur that carried the accumulated weight of months of silent agony, fierce devotion, and boundless love. "When you fell," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that shook Elena to the core of her being, "my spirit left my body. In that second, Elena, I knew that if the mountain took you, there would be no breath left in this chest worth keeping." Elena stared up at him, her throat tightening, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "Silas," she breathed, her hand sliding up his chest to rest against the warm, strong curve of his neck, her fingers feeling the frantic pulse at his throat. Silas shook his head slowly, his dark eyes burning into hers with a light that seemed to reach into the deepest, most hidden chambers of her soul. "Listen to me, Elena," he said, the words pouring from his lips with the unvarnished truth of a man who had faced death and chosen life. "For 10 winters, I have walked across these mountains alone. I fought the soldiers. I hunted in the snow. I told myself that an Apache warrior needs only his rifle, his horse, and the freedom of the high country. I believed that my heart was made of mountain stone, and that I would die on a battlefield and be forgotten like the dust." He paused, his jaw working as he swallowed the tightness in his throat, his hand moving from her hair to cup the delicate curve of her jawline with breathtaking gentleness. "And then came the storm. I heard your cry through the blizzard. I walked into that cabin, and I saw you on the floor, fighting for the life of your child. I held your hands in the firelight. I watched you look at me not as an enemy, but as a man. And from that dawn, Elena, the world I knew was gone." He drew in a sharp, ragged breath, his thumb lightly stroking her cheekbone, wiping away a tear that had spilled onto her skin. "I have tried to be wise. I have tried to remember that you belong to the white man's world, that the town speaks with poison, and that I have nothing to offer you but the strength of my hands and the protection of my rifle. But every trail I ride leads back to your cabin. Every deer I hunt is for your table. Every timber I cut is for your roof." He looked deep into her eyes, his soul laid bare beneath the cottonwood trees. "I have no desire to walk any path on this earth, Elena, that does not lead back to your hearth. There is no sacred canyon, no council fire of my people, and no mountain summit that holds any beauty for me if you are not there at the end of the day. You are my home, Elena. You and Clara. You are the fire in my blood, and I will love you until the mountains crumble into the sea." Elena listened, and as his words washed over her, the last lingering scars of Caleb Vance's cruelty, the shame of abandonment, and the cold loneliness that had haunted her for 6 years shattered into 1,000 pieces and were swept away by the rushing mountain water. To be loved like this, not for what she could provide, not as an ornament to a man's vanity, but for the sacred essence of who she was a gift so magnificent that it overwhelmed her entire being. Tears poured freely down Elena's cheeks, hot, bright, and radiant with pure joy. A choked, beautiful laugh broke from her lips, a sound of complete, ecstatic surrender to the truth that had been waiting for them since the first night they met. "Oh, Silas," Elena sobbed softly, her arms sliding up around his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick black hair at the nape of his neck. "You foolish, noble, magnificent man. Did you truly think you were the only one whose heart was captured?" She lifted her face, pressing her forehead against his, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce, fearless certainty. "When Caleb left me, I thought I was broken beyond repair. I thought love was a lie invented to make women weak. But you didn't just save my life, Silas. You rebuilt my soul. You showed me what it means to be cherished. You showed me what a true partner is." She pulled back just enough to look into his dark, luminous eyes, her voice ringing with the unshakable conviction of her heart. "I don't want the white man's world. I don't care what San Rafael whispers, and I don't care what the territory says. This mountain is my home, because you are here. I love you, Silas Blackwood. I have loved you since the moment you put my daughter into my arms and wrapped us in your coat, and there is no other man I will ever call my husband." Silas let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a prayer answered after a lifetime in the desert. He did not speak. Words had served their purpose. The time had come for the ancient, sacred language of the body. Silas tightened his arm around her waist, lifting her effortlessly out of the water, carrying her up onto the soft, grassy bank beneath the sheltering branches of the ancient cottonwood tree. He set her down gently upon the moss, kneeling before her, his tall frame blocking out the rest of the world. The twilight had arrived. The sky above the Mogollon peaks had turned to a breathtaking canopy of deep violet, indigo, and burnished gold. The first evening stars, the sacred morning star of the Cheyenne, and the evening fire of the heavens began to twinkle through the fluttering cottonwood leaves, casting a soft, magical glow across the secluded glade. Elena reached up. With trembling, reverent hands, she cupped Silas's chiseled, weathered face in her palms, her thumbs tracing the high, proud arch of his cheekbones and the strong, determined line of his jaw. Silas leaned down slowly, his dark eyes never leaving hers until their eyelashes brushed. And there, beneath the canopy of ancient trees, beside the rushing water of the mountain creek, and with little Clara sleeping peacefully on the quilt nearby, Silas kissed her. It was their first kiss, and it was a revelation. His lips touched hers with a gentleness that was almost heartbreaking, a soft, hesitant reverence that asked for permission, tasting the salt of her tears and the sweet, clean warmth of her breath. Elena let out a soft, helpless whimper against his mouth, her lips parting eagerly, her arms wrapping tight around his neck, pulling him down to her with all the pent-up longing of her soul. The kiss deepened, catching fire like dry pine pitch beneath a summer spark. Silas's arms closed around her back like bands of steel, crushing her against his chest, his mouth claiming hers with a fierce, intoxicating passion that stole the air from her lungs. He kissed her with the hunger of a man who had walked through a lifetime of winter and had finally tasted the warmth of spring. Elena arched against him, her fingers gripping his muscular shoulders, surrendering completely to the overwhelming, magnificent power of his embrace. She tasted the clean, wild essence of mountain water, the rich warmth of his skin, and the undeniable truth of a love that was stronger than history, stronger than prejudice, and stronger than death itself. The world dissolved around them. There was only the rushing of the stream, the whisper of the evening wind through the cottonwoods, the sweet fragrance of crushed mint beneath their bodies, and the sacred, electric fusion of two souls who had become one flesh beneath the western sky. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, their foreheads remained pressed together in the gathering dark. Silas's hands gently framed her face, his thumbs stroking her swollen, reddened lips with infinite tenderness. He looked at her as if she were the only woman who had ever walked upon the earth, his dark eyes shining with a joy so profound it looked like starlight captured in stone. "You are my wife now, Elena," Silas whispered in his deep, melodic voice, speaking the words not as a question, but as a sacred fact woven into the fabric of the universe. "In the eyes of the mountain, in the eyes of Usan, and in the blood that beats in my veins, you are mine." Elena smiled through her tears, her heart so full of peace that she felt as though she could fly. She leaned up, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the center of his lips. "And you are mine, Silas, forever." They sat together on the grassy bank as the twilight deepened into a warm, starry night. Silas gathered the dry linens from the bushes, packing them into the basket with one arm while holding Elena against his side with the other. He lifted baby Clara from the quilt, the little girl waking just enough to nuzzle her face into the curve of Silas's neck, letting out a contented sigh before falling back to sleep in the protective embrace of the man she would forever know as her father. Together, hand in hand, they walked up the winding mountain trail in the cool, star-drenched night, heading back toward the warm, lit windows of the cabin on the ridge. They had found their sanctuary. They had claimed their love. And though the shadows of the territory were gathering in the valleys below, and the greed of evil men was preparing to strike from the dark, the fire that burned on the hearth of the Mogollon was now eternal, and nothing in this world would ever put it out. The golden sweetness of early June was not destined to last on the Mogollon Rim. In the frontier west of the 1870s, peace was often nothing more than a brief interlude between storms, and the vast, beautiful mountains had a way of attracting men whose hearts were as dark as the deep mine shafts they dug for silver. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, under a cloudless sky of blinding, brilliant azure. The high country sun was beating down with intense, dry heat, baking the red clay of the homestead yard until the ground cracked like dry pottery. Elena was kneeling in the garden plot beside the cabin, carefully hoeing the rich, dark soil around the thriving green shoots of her sweet corn and runner beans. A few feet away, in the cool shade of the porch overhang, 5-month-old Clara sat propped in her willow basket, gurgling happily as she played with a string of polished pine pitch beads. Elena leaned back on her heels, wiping her brow with the hem of her apron, breathing in the rich fragrance of warm earth and mountain pine. For the first time since Caleb had ridden away 6 months earlier, she felt an absolute, unshakable peace settling over her life. Silas was down by the creek, felling dead cedar logs to reinforce the corral fencing, and the steady, rhythmic echo of his axe rang through the canyon like a comforting heartbeat. And then the wind shifted. It did not bring the sweet, resinous scent of wild sage or cliff rose. It brought something sharp, chemical, and foul, the unmistakable, acrid stench of burning coal oil and scorching cedar timber. Elena froze. Her farmer's instincts, honed from childhood along the Ohio River, where a prairie fire could destroy a family's livelihood in 20 minutes, instantly took over. She stood up, shading her eyes with her hand, looking south toward the lower boundary of the homestead where the meadow met the mouth of the draw. There, rising into the pristine summer sky 300 yards away, was a thick, greasy column of black smoke. Before Elena could cry out, the sound of crashing brush echoed from the creek trail. Silas burst into the clearing at a dead run, his double-bitted axe in his right hand, his Springfield carbine slung across his back. He did not need to ask what had happened. He had smelled the oil, he had seen the smoke. He reached the porch in 4 powerful strides, his dark eyes sweeping the perimeter of the clearing with lethal, predatory vigilance. He took Elena by the shoulder, guiding her firmly toward the heavy cabin door. "Get inside with Clara," Silas commanded, his deep voice stripped of all gentleness, replaced by the hard, ringing steel of a warrior in battle. "Drop the heavy bar across the door. Keep the carbine loaded by the window. If anyone approaches who is not me, shoot through the loopholes." "Silas, the fire," Elena began, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "It is not a wildfire, Elena," Silas said grimly, his jaw tightening into iron lines. "The wind is blowing away from the cabin. It was set to draw us out. Stay within the logs until I return." He thrust his loaded carbine into her hands, closed the heavy cedar door, and waited until he heard the massive pine bar drop into its iron brackets with a solid thud. Then, Silas turned and sprinted toward the burning pasture. When he reached the lower fence line, the scene confirmed his darkest suspicions. A 60-foot section of the split-rail cedar fence that guarded Elena's lower hay meadow had been doused with kerosene and set ablaze. The dry pine needles and brush around the base of the posts had caught, threatening to spread to the stand of winter forage they had carefully nurtured for the horses. Silas did not hesitate. Dropping his axe, he seized a heavy pine branch, using it to beat at the flames, shoveling loads of damp red earth over the creeping embers with his bare hands and his shovel until the fire was starved of oxygen. For 30 minutes, he fought the blaze under the scorching midday sun, his skin blackened with soot, his lungs burning with smoke, until the last orange flame died to a sullen, hissing bed of white ash. When the fire was dead, Silas stood in the blackened clearing, his chest heaving, his dark eyes narrowing as he turned his attention to the ground. An untrained settler would have looked upon the scorched earth and seen only destruction. But Silas Blackwood was a scout of the Cheyenne Apache, a man who could read a trail on solid granite as clearly as an open book. He dropped to his knees in the unburned dust at the edge of the tree line, scanning the earth with microscopic precision. Within 30 seconds, the story of the arson lay fully revealed before him. There were 2 distinct sets of horse tracks. Both animals were heavy, iron-shod geldings, not the light, unshod ponies of Apache hunters, but large American cavalry-bred stock used by freight drivers and frontier mercenaries. Silas leaned close to the right track, brushing away a layer of dry pine needles with the tip of his hunting knife. The left front shoe of the lead horse had a distinctive, deep notch cut into the iron heel, the unmistakable mark of a blacksmith working out of the booming mining district of Silver City. Silas followed the tracks into the shadow of the lower canyon, 10 yards into the brush, where the riders had tied their mounts to an oak sapling to pour the coal oil. Silas found the physical debris of their presence. A discarded strip of greasy butcher paper used to wrap a plug of commercial chewing tobacco, 2 spent sulfur matches, and the dark, oily circle where an open-gallon jug of kerosene had rested on the sand. More chilling, however, were the boot prints. They were deep, heavy impressions, made by square-toed, steel-heeled cavalry boots, the preferred footwear of hired gunmen and territorial claim jumpers who sold their rifles to the highest bidder. Silas knelt over the tracks, feeling the crumbling edges of the red dirt. The riders had not stayed to fight. They had set the blaze, watched from the high rocks until they saw Silas running from the creek, and then turned their horses south down the canyon, retreating toward the lower freight road that connected San Rafael to the Silver City stage line. It was not an attempt to kill them today. It was a tactical probe. It was the signature work of Harlan Ramsey's syndicate. The mercenaries were testing the defenses of the homestead. They were measuring Silas's response time. They were letting Elena know that her home was watched, that her isolation was absolute, and that the shadows were closing in around her. Silas stood slowly, his face hardening into a terrifying mask of ancient, lethal resolve. He looked south down the canyon, his hand resting on the bone handle of his hunting knife. He knew the brutal geometry of this land. Harlan Ramsey and his hired gunmen had the law of territorial paperwork on their side. They had money. They had 20 seasoned killers in the mining camps ready to ride for $50 apiece. Elena's cabin was sturdy, but it was built of pine logs. A wooden fortress in the middle of a dry summer forest could not withstand a coordinated night assault. If 10 men surrounded the clearing with torches and rifles under the cover of a midnight moon, Silas could kill 4 or 5 of them from the loopholes, but in the end, the cabin would burn, and Elena and Clara would choke on the smoke. He could not fight this war alone from an isolated ridge. Sheriff Samuel Foster was a good man, but he was 7 miles away in San Rafael, bound by territorial jurisdiction and powerless against mining claims, until blood was spilled on the street. There was only one place in the entire territory where Elena and Clara would be safe. There was only one power in the Black Range capable of standing against the syndicate's greed. Silas turned and walked swiftly back up the mountain trail toward the cabin. When he reached the porch, he knocked twice, with a familiar, rhythmic cadence. The heavy pine bar lifted, and the door swung open. Elena stood in the entryway, her face pale with worry, holding Clara against her hip and the loaded carbine in her right hand. "Silas," Elena breathed, stepping forward, her hand instantly reaching out to touch his soot-stained arm. "Is it out? What did you find?" Silas stepped inside, closing the door and dropping the heavy bar back into place. He did not sugarcoat the truth. He looked into Elena's hazel eyes with that unvarnished, fearless honesty that she had come to rely upon above all else in this world. "It was 2 men on shod horses," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "They carried coal oil from town. The tracks lead back toward the Silver City Road. They are the men Ramsey hired to take this land." Elena's breath hitched in her throat. She looked down at little Clara, who was innocently chewing on her willow rattle, and felt the cold, familiar shadow of terror creeping back into her chest. "They are going to burn us out, aren't they?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They aren't going to wait for the court in April." "No," Silas replied, stepping closer, his large, warm hands gently taking the heavy carbine from her grip and setting it on the table. He reached out, his calloused palms framing her soft face, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that held no hesitation. "They will come back, Elena. Not in the daylight, but in the dark. They will bring 10 or 20 rifles, and they will bring fire to the roof. I can kill many of them, but I cannot guarantee that a stray bullet or the smoke will not touch you or the child. We cannot stay in this cabin. Where can we go, Silas? Elena asked, tears shimmering in her eyes as she looked around the beloved room they had rebuilt with their own sweat and blood. To San Rafael? Ramsey owns half the town. He has the judges in his pocket. If we go to the settlement, they will take this land by default. Silas shook his head slowly. We will not go down to the white man's valley, Elena. We will go deeper into the mountains, to the canyon of my people. Elena froze, staring up at him in stunned silence. To the warm springs? She whispered. To Ojo Caliente, Silas said, his voice ringing with sacred conviction. To the hidden canyon beneath the red cliffs where my clan is gathered. In that valley, the water is sweet. The walls are 300 feet of solid granite, and 300 Chihen warriors stand watch at the pass. No mercenary, no claim jumper, and no army patrol can enter that canyon without permission. He paused, his thumbs gently brushing the curve of her cheekbones, his voice dropping into a tender, solemn plea. I want to take you home, Elena. I want to bring you and Clara before the council of my elders, before my clan mother, Naline. I want to ask my people to extend the sacred circle of our hearth to you. If the Chihene claim you as a daughter of the warm springs, no man in this territory will ever dare to lay a hand upon you again. Elena looked into his dark, obsidian eyes. She saw no fear in him. She saw only the fierce, protective devotion of a man who was ready to bridge the chasm between two warring worlds to save the family he loved. She knew what white society would say. She knew that in the eyes of the territory, an American woman taking her child into an Apache camp was committing social suicide. But Elena Vance was done living by the rules of a society that had abandoned her to freeze in a snowstorm. Her loyalty did not belong to the politicians in Washington or the merchants in San Rafael. Her loyalty belonged to the man who had knelt in her blood and ashes, the man who had wrapped her newborn daughter in his own coat, and the man who held her soul in his hands. Elena reached up, placing her hands over his, leaning her forehead against his chest, right over the steady, powerful beating of his heart. I trust you, Silas, Elena whispered, her voice clear, certain, and ringing with absolute love. I will follow you into the canyon. Wherever your people are, that is where our home will be. Silas let out a deep, ragged breath of relief, his arms closing tight around her and Clara, holding them against his chest in the quiet center of the room. Pack only what is essential, Elena, Silas murmured against her hair. Warm clothes, your mother's book, and food for the trail. We ride when the moon rises. We must cross the high granite passes before the dawn breaks. Elena nodded against his chest. The decision was made. The hearth on the Mogollon rim would grow cold for a season, but the fire of their love was burning brighter than ever, guiding them away from the greed of civilized men and leading them straight into the sacred heart of the Apache Mountains. As the sun dipped behind the jagged western crest of the Mogollon rim, bleeding its final crimson light across the high plateau, a deep, indigo twilight settled over the mountain homestead. Inside the cabin, Elena moved with quiet, focused urgency. She did not weep. She did not waste precious time mourning the quiet life they were forced to leave behind. Under the soft, golden glow of a single kerosene lamp on the pine table, she packed their 2 leather saddlebags with the necessities of survival on the trail. A sack of roasted piñon flour, cured bacon, cornmeal, a tin of matches, clean flannels, and little Clara's tiny, turquoise-embroidered buckskin dress, and carefully, with trembling, reverent fingers, Elena wrapped her mother's leather-bound poetry book in a piece of oiled flannel, tucking it securely into the center of the pack, alongside her family's Bible. She walked to the stone fireplace, knelt on the braided rug, and used a small iron shovel to spread dry sand over the glowing embers, putting out the flame that had kept them warm through the long months of spring. She looked around the beloved room one last time at the clean pine floorboards Silas had scrubbed, at the sturdy rafters he had hoisted with his bare hands, and at the small willow crib where Clara had slept. She felt no bitterness. She knew that a house was only wood and stone. The true hearth, the fire that could never be stolen by greedy men, burned inside the heart of the Apache warrior, who was saddling their horses outside in the dusk. Elena bundled 5-month-old Clara snugly against her chest in the soft doeskin sling Silas had made, wrapping her own heavy woolen shawl around both of them until only the baby's dark, curious eyes peeked out into the cool evening air. She opened the heavy cedar door and stepped out onto the front porch. Outside, the mountain was cloaked in a thick, velvety dusk. The first stars were piercing the purple sky above the pines, and the air was crisp, cooling rapidly as the desert heat retreated before the high-altitude night. Silas was standing beside the porch railing, checking the leather cinches on his powerful bay horse and the pack mare. He had already strapped his bedroll and their saddlebags behind the cantle. He wore his fringed buckskin hunting shirt, his knee-high moccasins, and his Springfield carbine slung across his back, its oiled steel glinting faintly in the yellow circle of light cast by the glass lantern hanging from the porch overhang. Silas turned as Elena stepped onto the porch. He stepped toward her, his dark eyes softening as he reached out a gentle hand to touch Clara's cheek, then Elena's. "The horses are ready, Elena," Silas whispered in his low, grounding baritone. "The moon will rise over the eastern ridge in 20 minutes. We will take the high goat trail through the granite notch. By dawn, we will be 10 miles south, where the canyon walls will hide our tracks." "I am ready, Silas," Elena replied softly, looking into his eyes with complete, unshakable trust. Silas turned toward the hitching rail to untie the reins. And in that exact fraction of a second, the mountain betrayed an unnatural, terrifying change. The night went dead silent. The crickets in the tall grass ceased their chirping all at once. The gentle breeze that had been sighing through the ponderosa needles suddenly died to a breathless, suffocating standstill. Silas froze. Every muscle in his tall, athletic frame snapped into lethal, predatory awareness. His nostrils flared, his dark eyes narrowing into the black shadows of the tree line, 50 yards across the clearing. "Elena, get down," Silas roared. Before the words had fully cleared his throat, the crack of a high-powered Winchester rifle shattered the mountain's silence like a bolt of thunder. Crack! The heavy lead slug tore through the cool air, striking the glass globe of the porch lantern hanging just inches above Silas's head. The lantern exploded in a violent, blinding shower of jagged glass, burning kerosene, and yellow flame. The burning oil splashed across the cedar porch floor, instantly plunging the doorway into swirling smoke and dancing, chaotic shadows. "Drop to the floor," Silas bellowed, his body moving with the lightning-fast reflex of a seasoned warrior. He threw himself across the porch, his broad frame completely covering Elena and Clara, slamming them down behind the protective, 4-foot stone foundation of the exterior chimney, just as a second and third shot tore through the night air. Crack! Crack! Bullets slammed into the heavy cedar logs of the cabin with dull, splintering thuds, sending showers of sharp pine chips raining down upon them. Across the dark clearing, 3 distinct muzzle flashes winked from the black shadows of the ponderosa forest, like the angry red eyes of wolves in the dark. From the tree line came the coarse, drunken shout of a hired mercenary. "Burn the horses. Don't let the renegade reach the trail." Silas did not panic. In the crucible of sudden, deadly violence, his mind became as cold and precise as an icicle. He pushed Elena deeper into the sheltered angle between the stone chimney and the porch wall. "Stay behind the stone," Silas commanded, in a fierce, low whisper, his eyes burning with a dangerous, terrifying light. "Do not move until I lift you." Silas rolled onto his stomach, unslinging his Springfield carbine with a smooth, practiced flick of his wrist. He did not fire wildly into the dark. He lay flat against the burning porch floor, his sharp eyes tracking the smoke and the sulfur smell drifting from the timber. A 4th muzzle flash bloomed from behind a fallen pine 50 yards away. Silas tracked the flash in a heartbeat. He leveled the heavy barrel of his military carbine, drew a breath, and squeezed the trigger. Boom! The Springfield roared with a massive, deafening report that echoed off the granite cliffs like a cannon shot, sending a long plume of yellow flame from the muzzle. 50 yards away, in the dark timber, a sharp, agonized scream tore through the night, followed by the heavy, crashing thud of a man falling from his saddle into the dry brush. "He got Jackson," a panicked voice cursed from the trees. "Keep firing. Spread out through the draw." The mercenaries' discipline broke. The sudden, deadly accuracy of Silas's return fire threw the attackers into immediate confusion. Silas worked the breech of the carbine with lightning speed, chambering another heavy brass cartridge. He rose to his feet in a single explosive bound. He seized Elena by the waist with his left arm, lifting her and baby Clara completely off the porch floor, holding them tight against his chest as bullets kicked up the dirt around his boots. He did not attempt to lead the pack mare. There was no time. Silas bolted down the porch steps toward his big bay warhorse, which was rearing and snorting in terror against the reins. With a single slash of his hunting knife, Silas severed the leather tie, grabbed the horse's mane, and hoisted Elena and Clara directly up into the center of the deep stock saddle. In the same fluid, unbroken motion, Silas placed his foot into the stirrup and vaulted up behind her. His long, powerful arms wrapped completely around Elena's waist, locking her and Clara securely between his body and the high leather pommel, his broad shoulders creating a human shield of buckskin and iron muscle to protect them from the gunfire. "Hold the mane, Elena," Silas shouted against her ear, gathering the heavy reins in his left hand. "Hold tight." He dug his moccasin heels hard into the bay's flanks. The powerful horse let out a wild, snorting neigh, lowered its head, and surged forward like an uncoiled spring, launching itself at a full, thundering gallop across the dark clearing. Behind them, rifles erupted again from the tree line. Crack, crack, crack. Sparks flew as lead ricocheted off the granite boulders along the path. Behind them, in the timber, the heavy drumming of half a dozen shod horses gave chase, the mercenaries shouting profanities as they spurred their mounts into the clearing, their torches beginning to flicker in the dark. Silas did not turn back. He leaned low over the horse's neck, guiding the powerful animal with his knees and a single hand on the reins, steering the galloping bay straight off the main road and into the mouth of the treacherous, boulder-strewn goat trail that climbed directly into the black, jagged peaks of the Black Range. The night closed around them like a curtain of shadow. The wind shrieked through the high granite notch as the bay horse carried them up into the rocky abyss, with the shouts of their pursuers fading into the distance, beneath the thundering of hooves and the fierce, beating hearts of three souls riding for their lives. And that, my dear friends, brings us to the breathless, heart-pounding conclusion of Part 3 of the Embers of Mogollon. What an incredible chapter we have walked together tonight. We witnessed the glorious awakening of the mountain homestead in the spring sunshine, the deep and sacred lessons of the earth and the intellect, and that unforgettable, tender moment by the rushing mountain creek where Silas and Elena finally spoke the true desires of their hearts and sealed their love under the cottonwoods. And now, the darkness has struck with terrifying fury. As Silas, Elena, and little Clara ride at a desperate gallop into the pitch-black, treacherous granite passes of the high country with an armed pack of ruthless mercenaries hot on their trail, how will this dangerous flight through the midnight mountains unfold? And what will Silas and Elena do when the territory's most powerful forces close in around them? I want to hear from every single one of you around our digital campfire tonight. What did you think of Silas's incredible reflexes and Elena's absolute, unwavering trust during the ambush? Leave your thoughts and feelings in the comments section below. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? Let us know your city, state, or country we love reading, where our storytelling community gathers from every single week. If tonight's story kept you on the edge of your seat and touched your heart, please take a quick second right now to hit that like button. Share this video with your family, your friends, and everyone who loves the true spirit of classic Western romance and courage. And if you haven't already, be sure to click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss a single second of the drama when Part 4, The Canyon of Sacred Waters, drops. Until we meet again under the mountain stars, my friends, stay safe, cherish those you love, and always keep the fire burning in your own hearth.